Welcome to the Socialist Forum 2023, here at the beautiful Z-salen at ABF-huset in Stockholm. And I want to welcome everybody that are here with us today in Z-salen, but also everybody that is watching the broadcast digitally all over the country. So all of you, very welcome. My name is Enna Gerin, and I am the Deputy Director of the Union Policy Institute Katalys. And we at Katalys, the publisher Verbal förlag and ABF Stockholm are very, very happy to be able to present for you today the economist Clara E. Mattei that is here today to talk about her book, The Capital Order, How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way for Fascism. And the book actually won the 2023 prize of the American Historical Association. Congratulations, Clara. And also, it has been pronounced by Financial Times as one of the best economic books of 2023. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Clara. Clara is an associate professor in the economics department of the New School of Social Research in New York. And her research contributes to the history of capitalism, exploring the critical relation between economic ideas and the technocratic policy making. And last year, she then published this book, that is the first book. And now, thanks to the support of Katalys followers, it is also translated into Swedish. And the title in Swedish goes Kapitalets ordning, hur ekonomer skapade åtstramningsdoktrinen och banade väg för fascismen. And you all can buy the book outside of Z-salen here at the entrance. And after our session, there will also be possibilities to get the book signed by Clara. So you will find her outside of Z-salen later. And in this book, Mattei investigates the origins of austerity in the World War I crisis to understand the logic, its logic as a tool of reaction against any alternatives to capitalism. And we will start today with letting her present her important and brilliant book. The presentation will be then followed by a discussion where we have two guests. Niklas Altermark, he is an associate professor at Lund University and a welfare analyst at the think tank Katalys. And we also have with us Anders Lindberg, political editor-in-chief at the newspaper Aftonbladet. But now, let me welcome to the stage is yours, to present the book, Clara E. Mattei. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? It's a real honor and pleasure to be here, and I'm so happy that the work that has taken me almost 10 years to write can be shared with you directly in Swedish. So I really thank the publisher and all the people who made the translation possible. Okay, so fundamentally, this work tries to develop a historical method that can really help us grapple with the most pressing, I believe, issue of our current times, which is austerity. Now, austerity is a word that is rarely mentioned anymore. We were hearing it a lot in the 2010s, and then we stopped hearing it. Now, the fact that we stopped hearing it does not mean that austerity does not indeed shape the possibilities of our daily lives everywhere in the world. From the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep, we are pressured by austerity in the form of dismantling of the social services that give dignity to our lives, in the form of interest rate hikes that produce unemployment and thus discipline us as workers, to privatization that again have the impact of making labor more precarious and more vulnerable to having to accept the condition of exploitation as the foundation of our society. And when I use the word exploitation, I would like us to use it in the technical sense of meaning any wage work, which is by definition work by which we produce more value with respect to the value that we put in our pockets when we get the paycheck at the end of the month, okay? Austerity is everywhere. Austerity is unmentioned, but austerity needs to be a frontal element of struggle, especially on the left. But I do believe that a big problem in the left is that it has lost a lot of critical concepts that could in fact help the fight. And austerity is a really good example of this. The conversation in public debate has mirrored very closely the conversation within academia, which has fundamentally depoliticized austerity. If you read anything about austerity, you will hear the whole conversation being about, does austerity help promote economic growth and solve the debt problem, right? So is austerity expansionary or is austerity recessionary, right? And this is ultimately where the debate is all at. There's the Keynesians that tell us that austerity just doesn't work, is stupid policy, is bad theory. And then there's the supporters who say, is a technical necessity, a bitter pill, but it will get us out of the financial crisis, okay? This conversation is leading us nowhere politically. And indeed, those who criticize austerity as being pure irrationality, policy mistake, madness, lack capacity to explain why is austerity so resilient in shaping advanced capitalism. Why is it everywhere? Can we really just attribute it to stupidity, lack of good theory, or corruption? That is not really interesting as an explanation because it doesn't offer us enough political thrust to be able to actually understand what is at stake, okay? So this is where history can help us. History is a very interpretative subject. Any historian knows that history is not just description, it's about interpreting what has happened in the past, and also finding out things that other historians have decided, I think also quite consciously, to stop talking about or to just not talk about, okay? And this is a really interesting example because the great existential crisis that capitalism had to go through after the First World War is a great example of how historians have been quite silent about one of the most interesting historical moments, I think, of the history of our society. 1919 was indeed the year of unprecedented crisis. And again, when I say crisis, I don't just mean economic downturn. I mean existential challenge to the pillars of a capitalist society, which are wage relations and private property of the means of production. In 1919, triggered by the fact that the Great War, the First World War, had opened up an incredible amount of experimentation about how to run the economy. Bureaucrats in power in all belligerent countries had been forced to undertake forms of central planning in order to survive the war and actually win the war, okay? So what I tell in the book is the story about how this state intervening in the economy for the first time in the history of capitalism in such a forceful manner, not just as a producer, but also as an employer, the state had to intervene to actually discipline workers because during the war, there was very little unemployment because people had been sent to the front to fight. And what has happened was that workers had gained an extraordinary amount of bargaining power that was incompatible with the necessity for capital accumulation in order to actually produce enough armaments and enough commodities to actually win the war, okay? So the state intervened to discipline the workforce in various different ways. It changed according to countries. In Italy, it went all the way to militarize the workforce, meaning that if you did not show up to work, you would get fined or even jailed for treason, okay? So the fact that the state had such a big role in managing capital accumulation during the war produced an enormous political effect. How? It politicized wage relations and private property of the means of production. And what I mean by this, I mean that people stopped thinking of these institutions as natural givens, okay? What keeps capitalism alive and strong is our conviction that wage relations and private property of the means of production are immutable givens that we just need to watch and accept. After the First World War, what was happening was that indeed people were instead reclaiming spaces in how to govern the production and distribution of resources, which is what the economy is about. It's about producing and distributing and allowing us to exist. And people are saying, you know what? We sacrificed during the war. We got disciplined. Now we want to be in charge and participate actively in the economy, okay? So the call for economic democracy, which I know there was a panel on this morning, was a call to really overcome capitalism as it had been understood until that moment, okay? So the book goes through the variety of interesting experiments that were being put into operation, not just in Eastern Europe. The book focuses on the center, the hub of Western capitalism, which was Britain, and in comparison with Italy. And I will tell you more why about the comparison. But what is interesting is that in the cradle of advanced capitalism in Britain, things were moving in a variety of ways. We had reformists who were really pushing for political priorities like permanent adult education and facilities for women workers so that they could rear children together, to the birth of the welfare state. The welfare state was born in 1919 in the majority of countries, okay? Two much more radical claims of workers' self-management. This was especially big with the Workers' Council movement that was real in Britain, but became very, very strong, of course, in Italy, very much influenced with from what was going on, of course, in those years in Eastern Europe, okay? So the council movement of l'Ordine Nuovo, the New Order, which was the magazine that was run by Antonio Gramsci and Palmiro Togliatti and other young militant intellectuals, was a real interesting moment in which you really saw how people were realizing how you could only debunk the bourgeois order if you debunked contemporaneously bourgeois institutions and bourgeois methodology, okay? So how we thought about the world was a fundamental element in the class struggle to overcome capitalism. Okay, so it's very interesting. I get into, we can't say much more than this today, but in the book, I really get into how the factory councils, so the idea that the workers were actually running assemblies to discuss democratically how to indeed produce in the factories, came with an understanding at a level of economics about how actually the worker was at the center of the economic machine. And it also came with the concept of praxis, the idea that theory and action were inseparable. So ideas could not come from above, from the intellectuals sitting in their armchairs. Ideas were emerging out of the very participation in these institutional transformations. So very, very powerful. And in Italy, you know, we got to a point in the summer of 1920 in which the whole peninsula, we saw all of the factories in Italy were being occupied for a whole month, while in the countryside, peasants had taken over the land and were running it via assemblies, okay? So a very interesting moment of possibilities, concrete experiments for a different world to come. Now, as always, the reaction comes. It comes hard, it comes intelligent, and it comes equipped with very, very fundamental tools that are still in operation today as we speak here in this wonderful lecture room. Austerity was refined as the most powerful way to tell people, you know what? You must be joking. There's no way you guys can participate in how we run our economic existence. You gotta step back and let us take over again, okay? So the second part of the book gets into the story of how the austerity code was put together at the very first international financial conferences that were organized in Brussels in 1920 and in Genoa in 1922. Now, interestingly, scholars have really never spoken about these conferences. I found out by chance. I'm like, how is it possible? But again, the silence of scholarship has political weight, and scholars are very implicated in not telling us stories that could otherwise get us thinking more deeply about our society and how it works. So at Genoa and Brussels, they come up with this austerity code, and I will tell you more about it in a second. And this austerity code was implemented very effectively around Europe. And what I do in the book is compare the story of specifically two countries, what happened in Britain and what happened in Italy. That would be very fascinating to get into what happened in Sweden and open that chapter, which would be something that I hope scholars will do. Now, why these two countries? The reason why I picked these two countries, well, first of all, is because I know the language in both countries, which that helps to look at the archives. That's very important. But also because there are two countries that really at that moment represented somehow supposedly the opposing possibilities of this world. We had the cradle of parliamentary democracy, the most important economy until that moment, which was Great Britain, an empire. And on the other side, we had quite a backward country that was just industrializing, and especially the birthplace of fascism. Benito Mussolini came into power in October of 1922. Okay? And the story that I tell is actually important comparatively because it shows how austerity was adopted and put into practice in a very similar way in these two supposedly very, very different contexts. A democracy, liberalism, a dictatorship, fascism. If you put austerity at the center of the conversation, you will see that the differences between these two ideologies and institutional worlds start, unfortunately, to close it, right? Now, what is austerity? I'm checking the time, so I make sure that... What is austerity? If we take history seriously, this helps us also rethink how we normally define austerity today. If you look at a dictionary or if you listen to economists, what they will tell you that austerity is all about budget cuts and tax increases. Right? This is what we're used to hearing. Now, guess what? This definition is the typical definition that tells you absolutely nothing. Why? Because it looks at the aggregate. The best way of looking at things for economists is the whole, the economic unit, right? The nations. It's Italy against Germany, against Sweden, it's the nation that counts. Now, the nation looks at the aggregate and doesn't look, this is what macroeconomics does, right? the whole. It doesn't look at the distribution or the class divisions within this whole. That is not a lens economists like. And we have a reason for that, and we will tell you more why. Okay? 1 second, I only drink a moment. Now, how can we rethink this definition, cuts in spending and tax increases? We need to start thinking how, first of all, this is only really a definition that looks at the fiscal side of the problem, okay? So we can define this part as fiscal austerity, which is one of the 3 elements of the trinity that I reconstruct, okay? But let's just look at fiscal austerity for a moment. The fiscal domain is about how the state spends and how the state finds the money to spend, right? And what you see is that actually it's not about spending in general. It's about where the state spends. So what you see is that austerity is about cutting the social expenditures, cutting housing, cutting schools, cutting health care, unemployment benefits, transport, what we need in order to survive as humans outside of the commodification of our labor, right? The welfare. That is being constantly cut and defunded structurally by capitalist states, okay? In the meantime, these capitalist states spend a ton of money subsidizing the private sector in all ways possible. Think about the military-industrial complex, that the profit shares are booming right now, right? Look, if you look at how much profits is being made, not only for in the war economy, but also in the green energy. There's a whole bunch of new speculation in the green energy. You know, the state spends a lot of money to bail out banks when they're in trouble. Money is being spent, but not for the people, for the elite that run the economy, okay? This is, so again, not cuts in general in the budget, but where the state cuts, okay? Second of all is not about tax increases in general, it's about regressive taxation. It's about increasing taxes on the people while taxes on the elite constantly shrink, okay? So consumption tax is a very big regressive tax, right? Because we're all paying it the same. So structurally consumption, and after the First World War, this is exactly what happened, right? After the First World War, regressive taxation was a fundamental element of austerity. The British Treasury was really happy because they increased consumption taxes on, guess what? Goods that were important for the people. For example, beer was taxed heavily in Britain. So was bread, was taxed in Britain. And in the meantime, Mussolini was great at abolishing the inheritance tax, abolishing all the capital levies that had been actually wielded after the war to get something out of the super profits that private capitalists had made during the war, okay? So regressive taxation, while the welfare state that had been just born in 1919, 1920, was basically slashed. There's this Geddes Axe of 1922 in Britain that was even larger than what Thatcher did in the 1980s, was a massacre for the nascent welfare state. So all of the projects of the Reconstructionists that had been so emancipatory were completely erased to the ground, okay? So this is fiscal austerity. But fiscal austerity does not operate on its own. It operates with a whole bunch of other policies that the state actively puts into operation. Monetary austerity is a very important one and is something that we know very well about because interest rates have been going up throughout the globe in the last year and a half, okay? Now, when interest rates go up, we tend to think, oh, it must be like a very technical tool central banks use to solve inflation, so they're doing something that is good for us. They're helping us get out of inflation. Well, this is unfortunately a very naive view that doesn't consider the fact that they are claiming this to be the only way to solve inflation, and we can go back to this. But the point is that it's also solving inflation, if ever it solves inflation, on the shoulders of the working people. Why? Because, of course, well, as consumers, we're hit because it's difficult to get credit if we need money to get to the end of the month. But most importantly, as workers, we lose our jobs. And this was so important in Britain in the 1920s because the way in which the strikes, the labor mobilization, the activism of British workers in the early 1920s was defeated was exactly by inducing a recession, a downturn, via monetary austerity that immediately hiked unemployment rates, okay? It got even to 17% of the insured workforce. And this, and I have the data for this in the book, it's not the very empirical, but it has, last chapter has some data though that I think is important. This went hand in hand with a complete stoppage of strike participation. Okay? So the immediate effect of monetary austerity, so stuff that we think is only about money, on labor relations was impressive. And it is still the case that today, the reason why the Fed started hiking interest rates was exactly because they were pissed off because workers were not going back to work, were striking, were unionizing, and were asking and winning wage increases and other benefits, okay? So monetary austerity is not separable. So monetary policies, macroeconomic management is inseparable from labor relations. And this is something that economists, again, don't tell you. Even if they do it, they tend to want to make sure that things are kept separate in our minds. And finally, we have industrial austerity, which Mussolini was very good at in the 1920s. Industrial austerity is privatization, really important. And neoclassical economists tell us today that if you privatize, what happens is that you bring down the reservation wage of workers, meaning that workers will be willing to accept lower wages. I just wanted to find actually a quote because I think it works better if someone else says it, not me. So this is Alberto Alesina, a colleague of mine who died recently, who was one of the most influential economists that was listened to at the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, but also at the level of the European Union, okay? Extremely influential. He was working at Harvard. He says, a decrease in government employment reduces the probability of finding a job if not employed in the private sector. And a decrease in government wages decreases the worker's income if employed in the public sector. In both cases, the wages demanded by the union for private sector workers decreases, increasing profits, investment, and competitiveness. So clearly the idea here is that if you privatize, of course, what workers are willing to accept is less. Yeah? Okay, so privatization, going with labor deregulation, which is very big. Mussolini did it by actually banning strike, making strikes and unions illegal, except for the fascist union. But anyway, forms in which the state directly intervenes to compress wages and to weaken workers' bargaining power. This is industrial austerity. Now, Mussolini was so good at this that he was widely applauded by the whole liberal establishment, not just in Italy, but especially in the Anglo-American world, okay? So one chapter I have in the book, I spent time in the archives finding things that were so obvious as soon as you opened the files, but again, no historian had been looking at these for some reason. And the reason is that it looks pretty bad. Because actually what you see is, again, a constant support of Mussolini's regime because of his capacity to implement austerity so effectively. And, you know, this is stuff we see not just in the case of Mussolini, but recurring throughout the 20th and 21st century, the support of the liberal establishment for authoritarian governments that are so good at delivering with economic orthodoxy, yes? So this is just Montagu Norman of the Bank of England, who is an emblem of liberalism. He was saying, so even Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, who expressed wariness in the fact that under fascism, anything in the way of otherness was eliminated and opposition in any form was gone, added in the same breath, "This state of affairs is suitable at present and may provide for the moment the administration best adapted for Italy." He continued, "Fascism has surely brought order out of chaos over the last few years. Something of the kind was no doubt needed if the pendulum was not to swing too far in quite the other direction. The Duce was the right man at a critical moment." And then the British Embassy constantly reports how, you know, there is striking progress towards the stabilization of state finances. Strikers have decreased by 90%, and working days lost decreased by over 97%. And of course, an increase in national savings. So you see how ultimately the priority here was, of course, the capital order. Now, I'm going to spend just the last couple of minutes, and then I invite my colleagues and partners for the discussion. But I just wanted to say just two more things. Fast. The first is I just want to say that while I talk to you about the way in which, materially speaking, the elites win back power and foreclose alternative to capitalism, was accompanied by consensus building, right? So in a way, compulsion, coercion of the Trinity that indeed shifted resources, right? The whole Trinity shifts resources away from people, boosts our market dependence, meaning that we are compelled to go to work, given that we do need money in our pocket to purchase anything we need to live on, right? So this boosting of market dependence, which creates the vulnerability by which we do have to accept wage relations as the only foundation of our society, goes with, of course, transferring these resources to the saving, investing classes. Now, this material oppression that the austerity trinity delivers goes hand in hand with the justification for these theories. We need to be convinced that what is happening is not political. It's the actual only necessary path forward and is the only technical possibility, as economists tell us. So in that historical moment, what is very interesting is that not only austerity was being molded as the way to resolve the crisis of capitalism, what was being molded was also the birth of neoclassical economics, which is, unfortunately, what all students study if they enroll in an economics university, okay, everywhere in the world. My department is a rare exception, even if, you know, there's internal fights. But anyway, yeah. So the point is that what students think of as the only economic framework possible is, of course, itself the product of a battle of ideas and a very active process of depoliticizing economics as a science. It is in that moment, at the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 1920s, sorry, of the 20th century, and then it gets developed in the 20s, that economics goes from being political economy to pure economics, right? The idea, of course, of the fact that economics is just like any other hard science, and we should just take it in, okay? Not only thus did these experts feel encircled in that moment, because they did feel that people were not buying the bullshit, and they wanted to actually participate. And they needed thus to say, no, we are the ones who know, you have to follow. This went with a theory that portrayed itself as above classes, but had the most classist assumptions that we could ever imagine. And they're still imbued in the models kids study today. They're just hidden by numbers, by formulae, by math. So what is interesting is that if you go to these first pure economists, they were using less math and were much more explicit about the one-way class struggle to crush workers they were developing. So how did they do this? They went from a framework, which was the framework of classical political economy of Ricardo and Marx, of seeing labor as the source of value, classes and antagonism, to a framework that is all about individuals, harmony, and they substituted the worker, the labor theory of value that we think is something of a past, with the entrepreneur as the center of the economic machine. So this change of the way, like the lens we wear today as normal citizens is very much influenced by this turn of perspective that really thus takes agency away from workers and tells us it's good that austerity is done because we do need to incentivize the virtuous individuals who then we need to think for everyone else's existence. So I'm going to close by reading you just a quote, if I may, and then I pass it over. But I think it's important to stress what these models are about. These are the economists that were working with Benito Mussolini, and they were not all fascists. Many of them were liberals, okay? The businessman is thrifty, a thinker and a calculator. It is this real man who most resembles the abstract man pictured by economists, who does not fuss like a sissy of a hardship to come, right? It is the entrepreneur who embodies the homo economicus, the rational investor. In the meantime, they wrote, all considered, it seems obvious that the classes with lower incomes are significantly deficient in qualities with respect to others, so that this deficiency is the cause of the low income and not the lower income the cause of the deficiency. So the classism that these economists were really, really vocal about after the First World War is something that is definitely real still today and needs to be exposed. And this is why history, I think, can be useful for the current struggles. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clara, for this presentation. As you heard yourself, you just have to buy this book and read more about these details that Clara summarized here in this lecture. And now I want to welcome up on stage then my colleague, Niklas Altermark, Associate Professor at Lund University and Welfare Analyst at Katalys. And also Anders Lindberg, political editor-in-chief at the newspaper Aftonbladet. Welcome on stage. So when I was reading your book, Professor Mattei, I was thinking about that we at the think tank Katalys, we have spent 10 years now long fighting against Swedish austerity policies. And often there has been during these years this kind of view on it that if only the politicians knew better, if they actually knew how economics works, they would like change these policies. But what I think is so powerful in your book is that you show with historical facts that austerity is like not just a coincidence or just like a mistake. It's not just bad policy, but it is like an intentional strategy of the capitalist classes against the working classes. Could you just say something about that before we let our guests in?
Yes, I think that is really the key message of this historical study, is that it is one-sided class warfare and we need to understand it and see it as such. And this could really help us understand that if we want to pressure for something that is not austerity, we need to know how the political pressure will operate against us. And I think one element that is important here is to understand also that there are no spontaneous markets, right? And this, I think, is very important, is that this book also tries to give us a message of hope by saying capital, and actually this allows me to explain the title, the capital order, capital as commodities, capital as money, capital as GDP growth, the thing, the expression of the thing, Marx would tell us, is the outcome of capital as a social relation. For the fact that the majority of us has no option but to go work for a low wage. This is what capital is about, yes? So ultimately, if we understand it that way, then it is obvious that for economists who want to safeguard the capitalist economy, the first thing they need to do is stabilize capital as the social relation. This is what austerity is meant to do. And this is very important because then it allows us to see how, again, macroeconomic management is always about class relations. And furthermore, it allows us to see that these markets need to be protected actively by the state, right? And also there, I think, is important. We are used to this folk history, but which it's always the market against the state, right? Oh, and then there's Keynes who's for the state, and then there's the neoliberals who are for the market. The state operates to support the market. The capitalist state operates to support the market. And if we want a different state, then we really need to rethink the foundations of the economy to pressure for a state that is actually for the people and not against the people. So economists really help work with the bureaucrats, the governments, to protect the capital order.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, one more applaud. So I want to let Anders and Niklas in. Do you maybe have any initial reflection on this presentation or on the book that you read? We can start with Niklas.
I teach this book to my students, political economy students. I have quite a lot of notes about this book. You cannot ask me like that, and it's hopeless. What I do think is that we rarely, in a Swedish socialist or labor movement context, hear people talk about class warfare, right? That's not a language that we're really used to, right? So I do think that what struck me when I read this book first time is that, okay, so even this like idea that austerity is a mistake, is stupid thing, I do think it's like, so, is itself an expression of ideology. Yes. And I do think that this is like, when we look at then prime examples of austerity policy in the Swedish context, and a lot of you are social democrats and will think about, okay, so what are the implications there for how we should think about like Göran Persson and the budget consolidation process in the 1990s? Yeah, I think that another really powerful message in this book is that we're not, when we're analyzing politics, we're not giving away moral judgments. It's not whether people are well-intentioned or not. No, we need to look at the logics of a certain policy and how it affects and shifts the power balance. And if we're socialists, we need to do it with respect to the power balance between labor and capital, right? And I do think, when I've myself I wrote a long piece in Aftonbladet Kultur last year. I think it was quite good, but the main message, sorry for not being humble, but the main message was definitely, some kind of mistake narrative, but rather we should reconceptualize this to think of this like a highly efficient set of policy tools. Yeah, that's my initial
reflection. Thank you. Anders?
Yeah, much have been said, of course, about the book. But if I look at this, I think that this is, in a way, a summary of a debate that's been going on in Sweden since the 90s. And what you can see very clearly now is that we have a kind of reinforcement mechanism between what you call here a kind of a strategy for disciplining the working class, disciplining normal people, so you won't ask too much questions, you won't ask for high salary increases, you sort of internalize the upper class ideology in the working classes, which make this kind of, you don't demand, you don't strike, you don't act, because you have accepted this kind of order. And of course, this is the Social Democrats has also reproduced this order. And what this have created now in the Swedish context is a kind of a reinforcement mechanism between the fascist ideology and the neoliberal ideology. So the Sweden Democrats pushes for more of austerity, more of deregulation, more of transferring power from people to companies to Elon Musk. I mean, Sweden Democrats is in favor of Elon Musk against Swedish workers today, which is fascinating as a nationalist party, of course. But what it does is create a situation where the fascist ideology strengthens the neoliberal ideology, which increases the inequalities, increases the powerlessness, and the voters goes to the Sweden Democrats. It's a kind of perpetuum mobile of idiocracy. Yeah. And we're in the middle of this in Sweden. And I think this is interesting when you see austerity as a power strategy, which you add in this context. What should the Swedish response be? How should we react to this? I mean, if we take your book and take the kind of Swedish example, there is two things, I think, that you need as a counter-strategy. The first one is to repoliticize economy.
Yes.
Because you clearly point out that you have sort of depoliticized economy. It's not a political issue if you raise interest rate or not. It's an independent central bank. By doing so, we have institutionalized the wrong answer to every question. And so this is the first one, repoliticize. The second one is re-regulate. And these two things, to say this politically in Sweden is impossible today. If you say the central bank doesn't work, I mean, everyone knows this, but it's impossible to say it. And that's fascinating. So this is kind of my reaction to...
Thank you.
To reading this.
Yes, Niklas?
Can I just, I think about, because we also have this idea now where we think back at the political right as it was like during Fredrik Reinfeldt's days, and he wasn't an explicit racist, so we're like, yeah, that's good work. I think a lot about his open your heart speech. For Clara, you don't know that, but he was saying like, we need to open our hearts. We need to reduce our living standards so that we can allow immigrants to be here. Of course, the premise of that is that there's a scarcity of resources. We cannot afford all. And what the Sweden Democrats has done, and the new right in the Swedish context, is that they have mobilized on that conflict line incredibly efficiently, right? So this whole idea of austerity, we don't have enough resources, we are forced to make cutbacks, social insurance levels need to be reduced. That is just perfect for any political force that is ready to say that it's these new people, it's these damn immigrants that are coming here, because that makes sense. If we take scarcity for granted, right, it makes sense to, that might be the case. And you see that. I've been studying like forums for people that are thrown out of the sick insurance systems, where the Sweden Democrats, they're really big force, their politicians are in these groups and saying like, look what the Social Democrats are doing to sick insurance. It's because of all of these immigrants, and that resonates with people. So really just to emphasize how reinforcing these logics are.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments?
And of course, the question here is scarcity for who? And it's the reason why you need class analysis and to bring back the question of the distribution of resources in society. There's plenty of resources, but are in the hands of the 0.1%, right? In the United States, indeed, 3 men own more than 50% of the rest of the population. But, in other countries, like in Italy, we are not that far. Absolute poverty keeps increasing. In Italy, we have 1 out of 10 people in absolute poverty now, while the numbers of the billionaires keep going up. So clearly here, the point is that it's not overall scarcity. It's where is the scarcity and how is it actively produced by austerity policies, right? And this is really, really clue. Maybe I would just like to point out to the point about repoliticization, which is a really, really important one. Because indeed, I think the whole point here is that we need to rethink economics as a profession and as economic policies as very political, and thus counter what has been happening, I would say, from the moment in which capitalism had to grapple with democracy, which is the de-democratization processes. So why is it interesting to look at the early 1920s? Well, because it was the moment in which capitalism seemed to be potentially, I mean, not capitalism, but at least society, potentially compatible with democracy. The tension between capitalism and democracy, indeed, let's put it better. The tension between capitalism and democracy really began to emerge in the immediate post-World War I moment. Why? Because people were actually gaining the right to vote, right? For the first time, workers had been historically disenfranchised, right? And of course, in the colonies, they were still disenfranchised. But for example, in Britain, universal suffrage dates to 1919. In Italy, also, all men acquired the right to vote in 1919. So the moment in which people actually started demanding democracy, that is the moment in which the elite and economists participated into this, tried to find ways to prevent democracy from spreading, and especially from preventing democratic processes to impinge and intrude in the decisions about economic policies, right? That was really the struggle for austerity, was the struggle to de-democratize, right? And depoliticization was the best way to achieve the de-democratization. So you could do it with Mussolini in Italy. When the workers were very embattled, you would go with the fascist dictatorship, and liberals were saying, yeah, it's the only way. The only way is, and that's what happened with Salvador Allende in Chile, we very well know. Once the things got really worrying, then you need a dictator. But you can do it in other ways, right? And I think the whole point here is that central bank independence that we take for granted was indeed institutionalized and diffused in the rest of the world in those years. The protagonists of my book were all about central bank independence in a moment in which the Labour Party was running a campaign to actually nationalize the Bank of England. And the Bank of England until then had been like a completely private institution, right? The moment in which it's clear that monetary policy cannot be left in the hands of few, the moment in which democracy demands to be taken seriously, that is the moment in which central banks emerge. And these experts then went to Brazil, went to India, went to Argentina, and they were able to implement central banks, independent central banks, with the idea that only independent central banks could operate prudent finances. And I love this way of saying it, so I'll say it. Ralph Hawtrey, who's the in-house economist at the British Treasury, said, central banks should never explain, never regret, never apologize. And this is exactly the whole point. And then you can do it in different ways. Central banks is one of them, and we know the ECB is the most independent of all, by the way. Explicitly in the constitution of the ECB, it is forbidden for political institutions to have any say or any influence. But then you can do it in different ways, right? You can find technical ways. I know that here in Sweden, for example, there is the constraint of a budgetary surplus, and that becomes technical. In Italy, we put the balanced budget constraint in the constitution. So there's different ways in which you can de-democratize the economic space. And again, it's a matter of, it's a spectrum of possibilities, and that is what we need to be aware of.
I was thinking, Anders, maybe some words about the Swedish social democracy and these last decades where the party has become obsessed with like implementing this austerity politics or accepting this the politicization of them. And what do you think about the ability to actually be able to abandon this and change on these policies, and if it is important now these years ahead?
I think that if you go back to the post-war period, what many people don't know today is that much of, for example, interest rates were political. So you wouldn't have, for example, the program for house building in Sweden. That would have been impossible with an independent central bank. You wouldn't have the expansion of the Swedish welfare state at all if you would have a central bank that would increase interest rate any time when the economy was going better. These enormous investments that were made in Swedish healthcare, Swedish schools, Swedish housing, that were made in the post-war period wouldn't been possible with today's economic structure, economic institutions. And this is something that you this is something, a history you really have to know, because these institutions today prohibit a similar policy. It's not possible with any kind of Keynesianistic policy in the Swedish framework that we have constructed. The Social Democrats have been today religiously affiliated to this, which is, of course, because of Göran Persson and because of the crisis in the 90s. And I were myself active in the Social Democratic Party during the 90s. I remember when I was sitting as a local politician in Gothenburg closing down kindergartens because we didn't have any money. And of course, from that experience arise a certain feeling of, okay, you need to have control of your finances. All of the people running the Social Democratic Party today are based in that experience. The party leader, the economic spokesman, etc., everyone is based on that experience. They have also been sitting closing down kindergartens, as I have. And of course, that is hard to change. So when we write about this, we usually say it's the ghost of the 90s that sort of still haunts the Social Democratic Party. And I think that we need to sort of take this ghost. There is some parts of it that is still true. I mean, we don't want to get back in a situation like in the 90s. But we need to have money to do things. We need to start borrowing for investments, for example. So this narrative needs to change, I think, within the Social Democratic Party. And when I'm traveling around in the Social Democratic organization, especially the trade unions today, I hear this a lot. I hear everyone taking up these issues. And I think it's coming. I think it's changing today, which partly because of the economic international discussion and partly because a welfare crisis that we never have seen. If you take the big hospitals in Sweden today, none of the bigger hospitals have a budget in balance. Everyone has gigantic deficits. Sahlgrenska in Gothenburg have 1.7 billion crowns in a deficit this year. So you will have an enormous effect on the Swedish welfare if you don't start changing the economic policy. And so I think this will happen. But as I said, I mean, this ghost of the 90s is strong. And you need to really you need to get these kind of feelings out that this ghost is creating.
Niklas, do you want to elaborate?
As always, ready to speak about the 90s. I think that Anders is absolutely right.
It's our trauma. It's our trauma, Clara.
It is a trauma. It's a national trauma.
And but the thing with trauma is that there's this really great text by Wendy Brown that's called about left melancholia, about this, how we nurture the trauma, how we try to relive the trauma, how we fail to break free of the trauma, right? And so when I hear about the empty barns, for example, tomma ladorna, fulla ladorna, whatever, this is like it resembles like how some kind of trauma dealing, right? I do think that if we do that, and this just to shift focus back to like the balance of power here, is that if we do this, this is of course also a way of changing the playing field. It increases the reservation wage, for example. If people have somewhere to live, if people have a decent life, although not working, right? So we also need to take on board the fact that all of this gradual erosion of welfare has systematically moved power, from labor to capital.
Absolutely.
Right. And that's the kind of analysis that we need. But unfortunately now, I think that public discourse doesn't allow this. You will be tainted as a crazy Marxist if you do this. If I write this, but maybe I am then. Yeah, maybe we are.
No, but I think something is changing. I think Anders is lifting up that there is something happening in the economic sphere. that can be very hopeful. Clara, you describe in the book the origins and then the function of austere economic policy making. When you think about capitalism now in the 21st century, what would you say are the main insights of your historical analysis for the labor movements of today? What should they bring with after reading this book, and what could we bring with us in the struggle?
Yeah, well, I think the reason why one should, let's say, own being a crazy Marxist is that...
It's not about craziness. It's really...
No, exactly. The problem is here that, unfortunately, given that we are still under capitalism, the tendencies that were visible in the 1920s and the operation of class warfare then has not changed that much. Actually, what is impressive is that if you read what these guys were writing then, it is like reading the newspapers today, right? So I think this is one important element, is indeed to be able, from the left, to have a long-run perspective on things, to have a systematic perspective on things, right? Not to reduce it all, oh, it's the neoliberal exception, it's the folly of the neoliberal moment. No, unfortunately, there's much more than this. So we got to really know the enemy if we want to have the tools to be able to fight strongly. And so I think this is, I mean, at least my role has been to try to develop this historical study to provide at least the beginning of these tools that then, of course, need to be developed as people participate in social transformations, right? So that's another thing. One should really, really, really go against this division of labor by which those who think and find out how things should work are the academics, are the elite. No, that is exactly what keeps us disempowered, right? Again, austerity disempowers us materially, because we rarely have time to even sit and chat with our family because we're so worried about having to pay our bills and finding a job for that. But it disempowers us, especially conceptually, by giving us a sense that economics is not something that we can know about, and thus we have no... we really don't have the knowledge to dispute what economists are trying to say, right? And I think this is really the key point, is that we need to stop being deferential toward people that have a PhD in economics, because they've been brainwashed for years, and they, of course, believe very much in what they're saying, so of course they will think that they are neutral and above class bias. But this is exactly the power of ideology, going back to why it's important to read the classics and to read Marx in particular, right? So I think this is very important, is let's dispute this realm of economics that should be something that we don't have a say in. Let's recall our agency and participate in this direction.
Thank you. Niklas, I was just thinking about you. You were talking about scarce resources as one mechanism that is paving the way for today's radical right and right populist.
The idea that there's a scarcity of resources, of course.
How this is propelling them. But do you have any more things that are helping out this development when it comes to the connection between austerity and, for example, the rise of the Sweden Democrats?
Yeah, I think there's good research from Sweden and from elsewhere that really signals that there's a connection, that hard-hit communities by welfare cutbacks that are suffering from austerity, that are suffering from rent hikes, are more likely to embrace these ideas, right? So then the challenge is to understand, okay, how come? What is the mechanisms that makes this happen? I was touching upon one of them earlier, and that's the very idea that we don't have enough. We're a poor country. We never talk about, the distribution of resources in terms of class, as Clara mentioned, of course. But this You want me to face the audience? Okay, sorry, I can do that. So that is one of the mechanisms that this happens through, right? That this idea that we don't have enough will, of course, make it more easy for racists to blame the migrants, right? That is one of them. The other is that the very idea that politics can build a better society, that politics have power to change the course of society, that the people can decide what kind of society we want to live in, that idea appears today, I think, as more or less outdated. Okay, what we have is like a left that largely has been saying, okay, we may not be able to build a better society, but we will try to defend the remnants of the welfare state better than a right-wing government. But that is not exactly inspiring, right? It's like, you know, surrendering to defeatism, basically. Right, and then we have like the resentment-driven right in Sweden, and they're not selling us the promise of a better society either. What they're selling us is the promise to punish those that are responsible for this. Social Democrats, especially working at ledarsidan at Aftonbladet, migrants and feminists, right? So they're not saying we're creating a better society. They're fulfilling the need that we have, that someone should be punished for what is happening, right? And I think it's a very, very reactive government that we have now. It's a very, very repressive political discourse that we're engaged in. And this is because over us looms this ideology that economy is separate from politics, hence politics is unable to change anything fundamentally in society, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
And Anders, what should we do? How do we change this ahead?
Yeah, thank you for that question.
The last minutes.
No, but I think that if you go back to the book, what you can see is that this neoliberal strategy is not only an economic strategy, it's a strategy of power.
Yes.
And it's a strategy of how to use power to enable or forward certain class interests from the upper classes, from the owning classes. And seen as that, and not only as an economic system, and not only as truth, which I think more or less it is today, then you start to demystify these kind of mechanisms. So if I would say some things I think should be done, when you say repoliticize the economy, what I mean by that is, for example, saying that the central bank maybe should not be independent. Maybe we should have some kind of...
Absolutely.
Some kind of other economic structure, because this institutions today doesn't function, which we can clearly see in the Swedish example for the interest rates, where we basically moved all borrowing from the public sector to the private individuals, and now we have a borrowing crisis for private individuals. This was an active policy from the central bank. It was an active policy for a central bank to have negative interest rates, so that house prices skyrocketed. And now house prices, it makes it impossible for people to buy houses. And they continue to be too high. And now you have this enormous interest hike, which didn't continue this week, but is very, very high. So this number one, the economic institutions, and start actually questioning this. Yep. The second thing is questioning the role of capital in Swedish society. Capital is more or less tax-free in our system. One of the most controversial texts I ever written, and you know that's quite a few texts, was about having a tax on boats. And I was walking in the harbor here and looking at these super yachts and asking the question, why is it tax-free to own a boat, but we have high taxes on healthcare professionals' wages? Where did that logic come from? Why should this luxury yachts be tax-free? So rethink capital, that capital actually can be taxed. This is also a debate you can't really have in Swedish society. And the third one is actually, I think, the left needs to come up with an alternative to the government. Because now we discuss the neoliberal ideology, the more or less fascist policies that the Sweden Democrats is now ramming through with this help, support of this government. The last thing today, if you follow the news, was that he should tear down mosques in Sweden. He's openly against freedom of religion. These kind of policies is possible because there is no real alternative on the other side that can win elections. Yes. And I think that these parties need to cooperate. The Greens, the Left Party, the Social Democrats. And they need to start now. So there you have. There I think that you have three very concrete things that can be done. And the thing is, with these kind of mystical things, like the mystical central bank, the first person who raises the hand and say, well, you shouldn't be independent, then you have the debate. So it's just, we start this debate and then see what happens.
Thank you, Anders. So I just want to say we are so thankful that you spent all these years and that you wrote this book, because you looked in detail of what was going on here in Europe 100 years ago. And I think it is a very good, this shows very good that this historic analysis can give us and help us get such a fruitful discussion and analysis of Sweden 2023. It is a really good sign that this book is really important and also relevant with this historical analysis to help us understand our society today and understand how and what we should do ahead. So thank you so much, Clara, for coming to Sweden, coming here and writing this book and talking with us about it. And we want you to come back. You are always welcome back to Stockholm. Thank you. Thank you.
Stop.
and also thank you, Anders and Niklas, for reading the book and being in the discussion.
Thank you.
And I will just turn to Swedish here at the end. Jag har 3 tips till er. Så först, köp boken här utanför. Clara kommer kunna signera den, så passa på nu när hon är här. Mitt andra tips är att om ni tyckte det här var intressant, så tycker jag ni ska skriva upp er på Katalys nyhetsbrev. Så kan ni följa böckerna vi släpper. Ni kan få bra bokerbjudanden. Ni kan se seminarier som vi arrangerar, konferenser vi arrangerar. Och det gör ni då på vår hemsida www.katalys.org/nyhetsbrev. Och så bara in med mejlen där, så håller ni koll på vårt arbete. Och det sista tipset är faktiskt att vi nyligen på Katalys startade en podd, en ekonomisk podd som heter Starta pressarna, och som då är ett samarbete med Aftonbladet ledarsida och går att lyssna på Aftonbladets app och också i alla andra poddappar. Så att om ni inte redan har följt podden, så gör det, så fortsätter vi de här diskussionerna framöver. Och ja, tack för en underbar publik.